So let's not waste time. Let's get right to it. I think it's fair to say that fans are very mixed on Halloween Ends and where it went. There's a small minority that thinks it's a very strong film, classic film, a cult film, but the vast majority, as the box office and a lot of the channels and Rotten Tomato score, you go through the list, there's just a majority that didn't quite care for it. And a recent admission by someone on the creative team of The Witcher, I think, provides some answers to why Halloween Ends didn't connect to its audience. Now, I've only seen the first couple of episodes of The Witcher. They appeared fine to me. I know that they moved away from the source material a lot, and apparently season one is solid, but it started to decline with season two. And someone on the creative team kind of confessed why it started to decline, and that may have some relevance for Halloween Ends.
LP was the first hire, and he brought along all the amazing talent that followed. My general rule was you had to be a fan, no questions. I've been on shows, namely Witcher, where some of the writers were not, or actively disliked the books and games, even actively mocking the source material. It's a recipe for disaster and bad morale. Fandom as a litmus test checks egos and makes all the long nights worth it. You have to respect the work before you're allowed to add to its legacy. That he even has to say this tells you just how bad the problem has become. I can't think of many businesses that would keep people, let alone hire them, who actively hated the job. Retail comes to mind, but even then, if you go out.
So, yeah, apparently some people on The Witcher didn't even like The Witcher that much. And it kind of showed up in the way characters were written, the way things were filmed, and so on and so forth. And there's the obvious parallel with Halloween Ends, where I can't deny David Gordon Green, I think, is a fan of the first film, but is he a hardcore Halloween series fan? That I have some doubts on. I think he just has his idea of Michael Myers, his idea of Laurie, and his idea of Haddonfield, and he was going to do his version of Halloween, whether we like it or don't like it. He did enough things with Halloween 2018 that the fans wanted, that fans, I think, thought that they were on the same mindset that this is what we want to do with Michael and Laurie, but clearly he had his own story with Michael and Laurie. That is, to put it mildly, not exactly mainstream understanding of Michael Myers or Laurie. If you've seen Halloween Ends, Michael is insanely weak. He is much weaker than has ever been shown ever in any of the entries of Halloween. It was pretty shocking. You understand where he's going because of his vision for Halloween. So I think the lesson to take away is yes, in some cases, directors, writers should be given the liberty to do whatever they please, but sometimes it's okay to restrict them. But contextually, sometimes it is better to stick to the source material. That said, I don't agree with where this YouTuber is going when it comes to the larger area of all films. I think there he's making a big mistake.
Job, you have to be a fan. You have to love this stuff, because if you don't, everyone's gonna know. It's gonna show in your work. You shouldn't have situations with showrunners and writers saying things like they've never read comics because they don't know how to read the frames. That was from one of the heads for WandaVision. When she was asked about Mephisto's image being all over the show, she had no idea what people were talking about. She didn't know the character, the backstory, or apparently that it was even in the show. Compare this to the way that reboots were handled 20 years ago. We saw reboots of Johnny Quest, G.I. Joe.
Now, I'm not sticking up for the MCU because I do think the vast majority of the MCU has been very disappointing and very weak. And if you're a comic book reader and like Marvel Comics, you've been very shocked at how much they moved away from the source material. So I'm not defending the MCU per se. And I do agree in their case, a lot of writers and directors clearly are hostile or ignorant of the source material. But there is a fact that he conveniently ignores that we have Batman and Batman Returns. For those who don't know, Tim Burton is on record that he's not much of a comic book person. Now, I know there's some evidence he did a little bit of research for Batman and Batman Returns. He did read a few of the comics, but for the most part, he doesn't know the Batman comics. He doesn't care about the Batman comics. And if you've seen Batman and Batman Returns, they are radically different from the source material. They just moved away from the comics in so many cases. Now, for me, those two films are some of the best films I've ever seen, and I think they're legitimately great films onto themselves. So the fact that they don't reflect the source material or Tim Burton doesn't really care about the Batman TV show or the Batman comic is kind of irrelevant. Those are really strong, good films, and they're good films because Tim Burton is very talented and he had a very interesting vision for Batman. You can dislike the films, that's fine, but if you're willing to give his vision a chance, I think they're pretty remarkable. And they're not cookie cutter, they're not MCU films, they're very much the product of his imagination. So I think we can come up with two kind of tentative rules if you're not going to respect the source material. One, you have to be very, very talented. And I think the problem is the new generation of people who start to do things in the Hollywood industry from the late 90s to the 2000s to now are just not very talented. So the generation has just lost a lot of talented people. And that's being reflected in the products, which is that it's just very weak. It's very derivative. It doesn't seem to go anywhere. Secondly, if you're not that talented, you can still try to move away from the source material if you're going to try to do something genuinely creative. For instance, Eyes Wide Shut by Kubrick, yes, it shares a lot of the plot of the source material because I can read German, so I can actually read the novella, but it has a very, very radically different story, and he's telling it in a very unique fashion. To this day, I don't think we know what is going on with Eyes Wide Shut. And so it's fine to do something very weird and interesting and creative. I just don't think that happened with Halloween Ends. In a lot of ways, it did come off like an MCU film. It seemed to have a couple of interesting ideas. It seemed to be playing with some very weird concepts and theories, but it's not really that much in the film. Maybe Michael Myers and the residents of Haddonfield are being controlled by a larger conspiracy. Maybe the radio tower was controlling Michael the whole time. We don't know. I mean, there are hints that this is happening. There are hints that the silver shamrock in Season of the Witch is at work here, but we don't really know. So it seems to be playing at being a Season of the Witch film, but it's not like Season of the Witch, which is fully committed to being a kind of very weird and odd conspiracy thriller, and is very hard to categorize even as a horror film. And Halloween Ends, they kind of have a pastiche. You have some interesting ideas, but you have a lot of conventional ideas. Even its main thing, that the main villain doesn't show up until the end, that's been done before with Nightmare on Elm Street and with Friday the 13th. So even on its own grounds, it wasn't that creative. So I do think there is a case for letting directors and writers do their own thing. But unless you're that talented, you're probably safer going to the source and not going too far from where the franchise has been. Or if you are going to move away from the franchise or from, quote, the fan expectation, it had better be a very interesting or weird idea we haven't really seen before. But what we saw in Halloween Ends is kind of things that have been played with the horror genre before. So even from that angle, it wasn't all that creative. But what do I know? I'm just a Halloween fan and I'm just a comic book fan.